Chapter 12. The Gypsy Woman. No sooner had Mr. Mason joined the group of guests than a servant entered to announce the arrival of an old gypsy woman who was supposed to be a skilled fortune-teller. The ladies were very excited and decided to ask her to tell their fortunes. Miss Ingram, as usual, was first and spent 15 minutes alone with the old woman in the library. She came back looking cross. "It's just childish nonsense. How can you all believe in that sort of thing?" she said, picking up a book and pretending to read it. But as she frowned more and more and did not turn a page, I assumed that the gypsy's words were more important to her than she wanted us to think. Next, 3 young ladies went in together and came back full of praise for the gypsy's skill. "She's old and dirty and ugly," they cried, shocked. "But she knows everything about us, everything." While the gentlemen were calming them down, the servant entered the room again. "Excuse me, miss," he said to me. "The gypsy says there's another young single lady in the room. She refuses to leave the house until she's seen all the young ladies. It must be you." "Oh, I'll go," I said gladly. I was curious to see the gypsy. She was sitting in an armchair in the library, murmuring words over a little black book. Her large black hat covered most of her face, but when she lifted her head, I saw her dark eyes. "So, you want me to tell your fortune?" she asked. "Well, I must warn you, I don't believe in your skill." "I expected that. Why don't you tremble?" "I'm not cold." "Why don't you turn pale?" "I'm not ill." "Why don't you ask me to tell your fortune?" "I'm not a fool." The old woman laughed and started smoking a short black pipe. "I can prove that you're cold and ill and a fool," she said. "Listen, you're cold because you're alone. You're ill because you lack love. And you're a fool because love is near you and you won't take one step to reach it." "That's true of many people," I said, interested. "Yes, but especially true of you. I can see that happiness is waiting for you if you really want it. Tell me, in that room of fine people, isn't there one face you look at? One person you're interested in?" "I hardly know the ladies and gentlemen here," I answered. "Well, you surely know the master of the house. What do you think of his relationship with his guests, and with one particular guest?" asked the gypsy, smiling wickedly. "They're all very friendly with each other," I replied cautiously. The gypsy seemed to know a lot about Thornfield. "Friendly? I'd say more than that. In fact, I'd go so far as to mention the name of Blanche Ingram and the word marriage. They will obviously be an extremely happy couple, although I told Miss Ingram something about the Rochester property which made her look quite depressed. If a wealthier gentleman comes along, Mr. Rochester might lose his beautiful bride." "But I came to hear about my future, not Mr. Rochester's." "It depends on whether you're going to stretch out your hand for happiness. Let me look at your face. Your eyes and your mouth show me that feelings are important to you. But your forehead shows me that common sense is your main guide in life. You will never do anything wrong or shameful. Well, I respect that. I don't want sacrifice or sorrow in my life. I want... But that will do. I'd like to stay here looking at you forever, but I must stop acting now." Was I dreaming? What was happening? The old woman's voice had changed and become as familiar to me as my own. "Well, Jane, do you know me?" asked the familiar voice, and struggling with the old clothes, Mr. Rochester stepped out of his disguise. "Sir, you've been talking nonsense to make me talk nonsense. It's hardly fair." Do you forgive me, Jane? I shall try to, sir, but you shouldn't have done it. What are my guests doing, Jane? Discussing the gypsy, I imagine. Oh, and did you know that a stranger has arrived to see you? A stranger? I wasn't expecting anyone. Who can it be? His name's Mason, sir, and he comes from the West Indies. The smile froze on Mr. Rochester's lips, and his face went white. Mason? The West Indies? He repeated 3 times. Do you feel ill, sir? I asked, worried. Jane, help me, he murmured, almost falling. I helped him to sit down and sat with him. He took my hand and rubbed it gently. I wish I were on an island with you and nobody else, with no trouble or danger or terrible memories to make me suffer. How can I help you, sir? I'd give my life to help you. Jane, if I need help, I'll ask you, I promise. Get me a glass of wine now. I fetched one from the dining room and gave it to him. He looked less pale, but very stern. Jane, if all those fine guests of mine came and spat at me, what would you do? He asked. Turn them out of the house, sir, if I could. But if they only looked at me coldly and whispered behind their hands about me, and then left me one by one, I'd stay with you, sir, to comfort you. And if the whole world disapproved of me, would you still stay with me? If you deserved my friendship, as I'm sure you do, I wouldn't care about other people's disapproval. Thank you, Jane. Now go and ask Mr. Mason to come and see me. So I did, and leaving the 2 men in the library, went to bed. Much later I heard him showing Mr. Mason to his bedroom, and was glad that Mr. Rochester sounded so cheerful. Chapter 13. The Stranger is Attacked. I was woken by the full moon shining in on me, as I had forgotten to draw my curtains. Suddenly, a wild, terrible cry broke the silence, echoing throughout the house. My heart missed a beat. What could it mean? It came from the top floor. Then I heard the sounds of a desperate struggle just above my room. Help! 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 Won't anyone help me? Rochester! Rochester! For God's sake, come! Shouted a voice from upstairs. Bedroom doors were opened as the guests woke up. What's happening? Fetch a candle. Is it a fire? Are there burglars? Where's Rochester? He isn't in his room. Here I am, called the master of the house, descending with a candle from the top floor. It's all right. Don't be afraid, ladies. A servant's had a bad dream, that's all, and started screaming. Nothing to worry about. Please go back to your rooms. You'll catch cold otherwise. And so he calmed his guests and persuaded them to return to their rooms. But I knew that the sounds I had heard could have nothing to do with the servant's dream. So I dressed and waited in my room in case I was needed. After about an hour, when Thornfield Hall was completely silent again, there was a cautious knock on my door. "Are you awake, Jane?" asked the voice I had been expecting. "Yes, sir, and dressed." "Good. I need you. Come and help me. Bring a clean cloth with you." We went quietly up to the top floor, where he unlocked one of the small black doors. "Do you feel faint at the sight of blood?" he asked. "I don't think so," I replied. We entered a room with curtains hung on the walls. One of the curtains was tied back to reveal a secret door into another small room. From there came an angry growling sound, almost like a dog. "Wait here," said Mr. Rochester, and went into the secret room, where a shout of laughter greeted him. Oh, so Grace Poole was there. He came out quickly and closed the secret door. Then he showed me why he needed me. In an armchair lay Mr. Mason, his clothes and his arm covered in blood. As we bent over him, he opened his eyes and groaned. "Am I going to die?" he murmured weakly. "No, man, don't be foolish. It's just a scratch," answered Mr. Rochester. "Now, Jane," turning to me, "I'll have to leave you in this room with Mason while I fetch the doctor. You must wipe away the blood with a damp cloth like this, and help him to drink a little water. But on no account must you speak to him. Is that understood?" I nodded, and nervously watched him leave the room. I could hear him turning the key in the lock. So here I was, in the middle of the night, locked in with a bleeding, dying man and a wild, murdering woman only the other side of a door. It seemed a long night, interrupted only by Mason's groans and by occasional animal-like noises from the secret room. I had plenty of time to wonder why these violent attacks happened. First the fire in Mr. Rochester's room, and now a physical attack on a stranger. And how was Mr. Mason involved? Why was he here on the top floor? I had heard his host showing him to a bedroom near mine on the second floor. And why was Mr. Rochester so frightened when Mr. Mason came to Thornfield? At last Mr. Rochester arrived with a doctor, who cleaned and bandaged Mason's wounds. "Strange," remarked the doctor. "The skin on the shoulder has been torn by teeth, as well as a knife." "She bit me," murmured Mason, "when Rochester managed to get the knife from her." "Well, I warned you not to see her alone," said Rochester. "You should have waited till the morning. Then we could have seen her together. Don't worry, man. When you get back to the West Indies, you can forget her. Think of her as dead and buried. Now, Doctor, is Mason ready to be moved? I have a carriage waiting outside. You'll take him home with you to avoid gossip, and then in a few days he'll be fit enough to leave the country." Although it was now early morning, the house was still in total silence, and so there were no witnesses to see Mason being helped downstairs and put in the carriage. "Look after him, Doctor," said Rochester. "Goodbye, Dick. Edward, make sure she's taken care of. Make sure she's treated well." Mason could not continue, but burst into tears. "I'll do my best, Dick, as I always have done," replied Rochester, shutting the door of the carriage, which rolled away. "But I wish there was an end to it," he murmured to himself. As we were walking back through the garden to the house, he said to me, "Jane, you've had a strange night. You look pale. Were you afraid when I left you alone with Mason?" "Not of Mason, sir, but of Grace Poole in the secret room. But I'd locked her door. I would never leave you in danger." "Will she go on living here, sir?" I asked. "Oh, yes. Don't think about her." "But I'm sure your life is in danger while she's here." "Don't worry, I can take care of myself. I'm in more danger while Mason's in England. I live in constant fear of a disaster." "But Mr. Mason's weak. You have great influence with him." "Yes, he wouldn't knowingly hurt me, but by one careless word he could destroy, if not my life, at least my chance of happiness. Sit down with me on this bench, Jane. I want to ask you something." The early sun warmed the bench and the birds were singing. "Now, Jane, suppose a boy in a foreign country makes a mistake. Not a crime, mind you. The results of this mistake have a terrible effect on his whole life. He comes home after years of suffering and meets someone who is fresh and good and pure. Now, can he ignore society? Can he forget the past and live the rest of his life with her in peace?" It was a difficult question to answer. In the end, I said, "You can't rely on a human being to cure you of evil and give you peace. You must ask God's help." "But I think I've found the cure. It's—" He paused. I held my breath. I almost thought the birds would stop singing to hear the name he was going to say. "Yes," he said in quite a different, hard voice. "You've noticed my love for Miss Ingram, haven't you? Don't you think she'll cure me of my wickedness, Jane? Oh, I can hear some of the guests in the garden. Go into the house by the back door." As I went one way and he another, I heard him say cheerfully to the gentleman, "Mason's already left. I got up early to say goodbye to him." Chapter 14. Trouble at Gateshead. When I was a child at Gateshead, Bessie the nursemaid used to say that to dream of children was a sure sign of trouble to come. For a whole week now I had dreamt of a small child every night, and perhaps Bessie was right, as a message came from Gateshead. It appeared that my cousin John Reed, who had spent and wasted all his money and some of his mother's, and been in debt or in prison most of his life, had killed himself a week before. And then Mrs. Reed, whose health had been badly affected by worrying about her son, had suddenly fallen ill when she heard of his death. Although she could hardly speak, she had recently managed to express a wish to see me, and so my cousins Eliza and Georgiana had sent their coachman Robert to bring me back to Gateshead. I felt I could not refuse to see my aunt, perhaps for the last time. So I went to ask Mr. Rochester's permission to leave Thornfield for a while. I found him talking to Miss Ingram, who looked at me in disgust when I interrupted their conversation. "Well, Jane, what is it?" he asked, when we had left the room full of guests and gone into the library. "Please, sir, I would like permission to visit my aunt, who is ill, for a week or two." "Your aunt? You told me you had no relations." "I have none who love me, sir. She's Mrs. Reed, my uncle's wife. Her son has died recently. I really can't neglect her now that she is dying." "What nonsense, Jane. Rushing off to visit an old lady who has never loved you. But I see you've decided to go. Where does she live, and how long will you stay?" "She lives at Gateshead, sir, 100 miles away. I'll stay as short a time as I can." "Promise me only to stay a week." "I can't promise, sir. I might have to stay longer." "And you certainly can't travel 100 miles alone." "They've sent the coachman for me, sir. I'll leave tomorrow." Mr. Rochester thought for a while. "Well, you'll need some money. I haven't paid you any salary yet. How much have you in the world, Jane?" he asked, smiling. I showed him my tiny purse. He took it and laughed as he counted the few coins. Then he took out his wallet. "Here is £50, he said, offering me a note. "But you only owe me £15, sir," I cried. "On second thoughts, give me that back. If you had £50, perhaps you would stay away for 3 months. Here is £10. Is that enough?" "Now you owe me £5, sir," I pointed out. "You'll have to come back for it then," he said, laughing. "There's something else, sir. You've told me you're going to marry soon. In that case, Adele should go to boarding school." "To get her out of my lovely bride's way? A very sensible suggestion. But what about you?" "I must find another job somewhere. I'll advertise." "Don't you dare," he growled. "Promise me, Jane, not to look for another job. I'll take care of that." "I'll promise, sir, if you promise that Adele and I will be out of your house before your bride enters it." "Very well. And now we must say goodbye." "Goodbye, Mr. Rochester." I set out early the next morning and travelled all day. As I approached Gateshead Hall, I realised it was 9 years since I had left it. In that time I had made some friends, gained much self-confidence, and finally lost my hatred of the Reeds. I was delighted to see my old friend Bessie again. She had married Robert the coachman and was very busy with her 3 young children. The house itself had not changed at all, but my cousin certainly had. Eliza was now very tall and thin, with a rather sour face, dressed in very plain clothes, and with a cross hanging round her neck. Georgiana, on the other hand, was still pretty but very fat, and wore extremely fashionable clothes. They did not seem pleased to see me. In fact, they more or less ignored me, but I hardly noticed their rudeness. I told the housekeeper that I would be staying for several days, and then went straight to my aunt's room. I remembered it well from my childhood. I had often been called there to be punished. Bending over her bed, I kissed her. "How are you, dear aunt?" I asked. I had sworn never to call her aunt again, but I did not regret breaking that promise to myself. I held her hand. "Are you Jane Eyre?" she asked. Her face, although deathly pale, was as stern as ever, and she removed her hand from mine. "That child was more trouble to me than anyone would believe. I was glad to send her to Lowood. And John, poor John, he needs so much money. Where can I get more money from? What will happen?" She seemed very confused and excited, so I left her to sleep. Her illness got worse in the next few days. I spent some time every day looking after her, and the rest of the time with my cousins, listening to their plans for the future. Eliza was planning to join a religious community after her mother's death, but Georgiana was hoping to stay in London with relations, to see the new fashions and go to all the parties. It was quite clear they had no real feeling for their mother and were almost looking forward to her death. One dark, stormy night, I visited the dying woman. She lay there asleep in her room, neglected by her daughters and servants. As I looked out of the window into the black emptiness, I wondered about the great mystery of death and thought of Helen Burns, who was so sure her spirit would go to heaven. Would my aunt's spirit go there too? "Who are you?" I heard the sick woman murmuring. "I wanted to see Jane Eyre. I must tell her something." "I am Jane Eyre, Aunt," I told her gently. "I know I'm very ill," she said weakly. "Before I die, I must confess what I've done wrong. First, I broke my promise to my husband about you. And second—" She broke off. "After all, perhaps I don't need to tell her," she said to herself. And then, "No, it's no good. I know I'm dying. I must tell her, and quickly. Jane Eyre, take the letter from the top drawer of my desk and read it." I did so. It said, "Madeira. Dear Mrs. Reed, please inform me of the address of my niece, Jane Eyre. As I am unmarried with no children and fairly wealthy, I would like her to come to Madeira to live with me and to inherit all my property when I die. John Eyre." "Why did I never hear of this?" I asked, amazed. "I hated you so much that I wrote back to him telling him you had died of typhus fever at Lowood. That was my revenge on you for causing me so much trouble," she cried angrily. "Dear Aunt," I said, "don't think about that any more. I was only a child. It's not surprising I was a nuisance." "You were always so angry and violent. Such a wicked child." "Not as wicked as you think. I would have loved you if you'd let me. Forget it all and kiss me now, Aunt." But it was too late for her to break the habit of dislike, and she turned away from me. Poor woman. She died soon afterwards, keeping her hatred of me alive in her heart, and no one at Gateshead cried for her. Chapter 15. The Future Mrs. Rochester. And so I set out on the long journey back to Thornfield. Mrs. Fairfax had written to me while I was at Gateshead, telling me that the guests had all gone, and Mr. Rochester had gone to London to buy a carriage for his wedding. It was clear that he would be getting married very soon. After a long day sitting in the coach, I decided to get out at Millcote, leave my luggage at the hotel, and walk across the fields to Thornfield. It was a warm June evening, and I felt glad to be going home. I had to remind myself sternly that Thornfield was not my permanent home, and that the person I was so looking forward to seeing was perhaps not even thinking of me. And then I saw him. He was sitting on the gate ahead of me, writing in a notebook. He noticed me at once. "Hello," he cried. I was trembling at the unexpected sight of him and could not control my voice, so I approached in silence. "So, it's Jane Eyre," he continued. "Why didn't you send for a carriage? It's just like you to come on foot from Millcote. Now, what have you been doing for a whole month?" "I've been looking after my aunt, sir, who's just died." "You come from another world, Jane, from the world of the dead. I think you must be a spirit, and absent for a whole month. I'm sure you've quite forgotten me." Even though I knew I would soon lose him, he had such power to make me happy that I was in heaven listening to him. "Did Mrs. Fairfax tell you I've been to London?" he asked. "Oh, yes, sir, she did." "And I expect she told you why I went there? Well, you must see the carriage I've bought, Jane. It will suit Mrs. Rochester perfectly. I only wish I were more handsome, as she's so beautiful. Can't you put one of your spells on me to make me more attractive for her?" "That's beyond the power of magic, sir," I replied, while thinking, to someone who loves you, you are handsome enough. Mr. Rochester was sometimes able to read my thoughts, but this time he just smiled warmly at me and opened the gate. "Pass, friend," he said, "and welcome home." I could have just walked past him in silence, but something made me turn and say quickly, before I could stop myself, "Thank you, Mr. Rochester, for your great kindness. I'm glad to come back to you, and wherever you are is my home, my only home." I ran across the field and into the house before he had time to answer. 2 weeks passed after my return with no news of the wedding. There were no preparations at Thornfield, and no visits to the Ingram family, who lived only a few miles away. I almost began to hope. It was the middle of summer, and every day the sun shone on the green fields, the white baked roads, and the cool dark woods. One evening, after Adele had gone to sleep, I went into the garden. I discovered a quiet place where I thought nobody would find me, but then I noticed Mr. Rochester had come into the garden too. Hoping to escape back to the house, I crept quietly behind him while he was bending over to admire an insect, but— "Jane," he said suddenly, "come and look at this beautiful insect." "Oh, now he's flown away. No, don't go back to the house, Jane, on such a lovely night. Come and walk with me." I could not find a reason for leaving him, so I accompanied him in silence. "Jane," he began, "you like Thornfield, don't you? And you even like little Adele and old Mrs. Fairfax, don't you?" "I do, sir. I really don't want to leave them." "What a pity," he sighed. "That's what happens in life. No sooner have you got used to a place than you have to move on." "Do I have to move on, sir? Leave Thornfield?" "I'm afraid you must, Jane." "Then you are going to be married, sir?" "Exactly, Jane. And as you have pointed out, when I take the lovely Miss Ingram as my bride, you and Adele must leave the house, so I'm looking for a new job for you." "I'm sorry to cause you trouble," I said miserably. "No trouble at all. In fact, I've already heard of a very good job which would be just right for you, teaching the 5 daughters of an Irish family. You'll like Ireland, I think. They're such friendly people," he said cheerfully. "It's such a long way away, sir." I was fighting to keep my tears back. There was an icy coldness in my heart. "Away from what, Jane?" "From England and from Thornfield and— well, from you, sir." I could not stop myself and burst into tears immediately. "It certainly is very far away," he said calmly. "Let's sit on this bench, Jane, like old friends saying goodbye. You know, I sometimes feel as if you and I were connected by a string tying our 2 hearts together. And if you went to Ireland, I think that string might break, and I might bleed to death. I wish I'd never been born, I cried. I wish I'd never come to Thornfield. No longer able to control my feelings, I poured out what was in my heart. I can't bear to leave, because here I've been treated kindly, and because I've met you, Mr. Rochester, and I can't bear never to see you again. Now I have to leave. I feel as if I'm dying. Why do you have to leave? He asked innocently. Why? I repeated, amazed. Because you're marrying Miss Ingram. She's your bride. My bride? I have no bride, he answered. But I will have one, and you must stay. I can't stay, I cried furiously. Do you think I can watch another woman become your bride? Do you think I'm a machine without feelings? Do you think, because I'm small and poor and plain, that I have no soul and no heart? Well, you're wrong. I have as much soul and heart as you. It is my spirit that speaks to your spirit. We are equal in the sight of God. We are, repeated Mr. Rochester, taking me in his arms and kissing me. Don't struggle, Jane, like a wild, restless bird. Let me go, Mr. Rochester. I am no bird, but a free human being. And I managed to break away. Yes, Jane, you are free to decide. I ask you to walk through life with me, to be my constant companion. You're laughing at me. You've already chosen your companion for life. I was crying quietly, while Mr. Rochester looked gently and seriously at me. Jane, he said, I ask you to be my wife. You are my equal, Jane. Will you marry me? Don't you believe me? Not at all, I answered. I'll convince you. Listen, I don't love Miss Ingram, and she doesn't love me. She only liked me for my wealth, and when I, disguised as the gypsy woman, told her that I had only a little money, she and her mother lost interest in me. You strange, magical spirit, I love you. You small and poor and plain. I ask you to marry me. You want to marry me? I cried, almost beginning to believe him. But I have no friends, no money, no family. I don't care, Jane. Say yes quickly. It's cruel to make me suffer like this. Give me my name. Say, Edward, I'll marry you, he cried, his face very pale in the moonlight. Are you serious? Do you really love me? Do you honestly want me to be your wife? I asked. I swear it. Then, Edward, I will marry you. My little wife. He held me in his arms for a long time, kissing me gently. Once he murmured, No family. That's good. No family to interfere. And then, I don't care what people think. And again. Are you happy, Jane? I thought of nothing except the great happiness of being with him forever. But while we were talking, the weather had changed. A strong wind was now blowing, and there was a loud crack of thunder. Suddenly rain poured down, and although we hurried back to the house, we were quite wet when we arrived in the hall. We did not notice Mrs. Fairfax standing in the shadows. Good night, my darling, he said, kissing me repeatedly. As I ran upstairs, I caught sight of the old lady's shocked face. Tomorrow I'll explain to her, I thought. Just then I was too happy to think about anything except our bright future. Outside, the storm continued furiously all night, and in the morning we discovered that the great tree at the bottom of the garden, which had stood for hundreds of years, had been hit by lightning and torn in half. Chapter 16. Preparing for the Wedding. I was a little nervous before seeing Mr. Rochester next morning. Was I really going to marry him, or was it all a dream? But I soon felt calmer when he came to meet me and kissed me. "Jane, you look well and smiling and pretty," he said. "You will be Jane Rochester in 4 weeks' time, not a day more. I'll send for my family jewels, which are kept in a London bank. They are for my bride, whether she's a great lady or a governess." "Oh, no, sir," I cried. "I'm too plain for jewels. I'm not used to wearing them." "I insist, Jane. Today I'm taking you in the carriage to Millcote to buy you some elegant clothes. In a month's time we'll have a quiet wedding in the local church, and after a few days in London we'll travel through all the countries of Europe." "Well, sir, you seem very eager to please me, but I wonder if you will agree to a request of mine." "Ask me anything, Jane, anything." "Indeed I will. This is my request. I ask you not to give me jewels and fine clothes." "If that's really your wish, I agree. But can't you think of anything I can give you?" "Well, I'd like you to give me the answer to a question." He looked worried and turned away from me. "Curiosity is dangerous," he said. "I may not be able to agree to this particular request. But what is it?" "How stern you look. I suppose that's how you will look when we're married. This is what I want to know. Why did you take such trouble to make me believe you wished to marry Miss Ingram?" He stopped frowning at once and smiled down at me. "Is that all? What a relief. All right. I shall have to confess, although you may be angry with me, Jane, as angry as you were last night when you told me we were equal. Well, I pretended to love Miss Ingram, to make you madly jealous. I wanted you to be as much in love with me as I was with you. And I suppose you didn't care at all about poor Miss Ingram's feelings. She only has one feeling, pride. Were you jealous, Jane? Never mind, Mr. Rochester. One more request. Please explain everything to Mrs. Fairfax. She looked so shocked last night." When I visited the old housekeeper later that day, I found she was amazed by the news that I was going to marry the master. "I'd never have thought it," she kept repeating. "Mr. Rochester, so proud and such a gentleman, to marry his governess." She examined me closely, as if to discover the reason for this strange event, and shook her head, still puzzled. "He's 20 years older than you. He could be your father." "No, indeed, Mrs. Fairfax," I replied crossly. "He looks much younger than that." "Is he really going to marry you for love?" she asked. I was so hurt by her amazement that tears came to my eyes. "Why?" I asked. "Do you think he couldn't possibly love me?" "No, no, Miss Eyre, but you must realise that this is a very unusual situation. You must be careful of your reputation. I advise you to keep him at a distance until you are married." Although I was upset by the old lady's words, I followed her advice, and in the weeks before the wedding I went on teaching Adele as usual. Only in the evenings did I spend some time with Mr. Rochester, and I was careful not to allow him to hold me in his arms or kiss me. Sometimes he was angry with me and called me a hard little thing or a cruel spirit, but I preferred that to being called my darling. I saw that Mrs. Fairfax approved of my correct behaviour, and I knew that he respected me for it, but it was not easy for me. I would rather have shown him my love. My future husband was becoming my whole world, and more than that, my hope of heaven. At last, the night before the wedding arrived. My clothes were packed and I was ready. But I was anxious to see Mr. Rochester, who had been away on business, so I ran out of the quiet house to meet him on the road. A wild, stormy wind was blowing, and in the garden I passed the wreck of the great tree. Then suddenly I saw him riding towards me. "You see?" he shouted. "You can't do without me. Jump up onto my horse. Together we rode back to Thornfield. While he ate dinner, I sat quietly beside him. He looked closely at me. "You look sad, Jane," he said. "Is anything wrong? Are you nervous about your new life?" "No," I replied firmly. "I'm not worried about that, because I love you. But last night I had a strange dream, a terrible dream. It was dark and windy outside, and before I went to sleep, I could hear a dog growling in the distance. In my dream, I was carrying a small child in my arms down a long road. I was trying to catch up with you, but I couldn't. And you still worry about a foolish dream when I'm close to you? But say you love me again, Jane." "I do love you, Edward, but I haven't finished my story." "Is there more? Well, go on." "I dreamed that Thornfield was totally destroyed, just a heap of stones. I was still carrying the child, but now I could see you riding away into the distance. I knew you would never come back. Then I woke up." "That's all then, Jane? Nothing to worry about?" "No, wait. There was candlelight in my room, and a strange shape examining the wedding dress hanging in my cupboard. My blood ran cold. It wasn't Mrs. Fairfax or any of the servants. It wasn't even Grace Poole. It was a horrible sight." "Describe the shape, Jane." "It looked like a tall woman, with long, thick, dark hair hanging down. She took up the beautiful veil you bought me, put it on her own head, then turned to admire herself in the mirror. It was then that I saw her wild, inhuman face. She removed the veil, tore it in two, and threw it on the floor." "And then?" Mr. Rochester seemed almost nervous. "She came to my bedside, put her candle close to my face, and stared fiercely at me. I must have fainted, and I suppose she left. Now, can you tell me who or what that woman was?" "Jane, you are too sensitive. That was just a dream. Don't think about it any more," he answered comfortingly. "That's just what I said to myself when I woke up this morning. But when I looked on the floor, there was the veil, torn in two halves." I felt Mr. Rochester suddenly tremble. "To think what might have happened," he cried, throwing his arms around me. "Thank God it was only the veil." After a few moments, he said calmly, "Now, Jane, be sensible. That woman must have been Grace Poole. There is no other explanation." "Perhaps you're right," I admitted slowly. "One day I'll explain to you why I keep her in my house. But tonight, go and sleep in Adele's room. You'll be quite safe there. Just dream about our future." Chapter 17. The Wedding Day. We had no friends or family to accompany us to the church. I had not told my Reed cousins about our wedding, but I had written to my uncle, John Eyre, in Madeira. Mr. Rochester was in such a hurry that he only allowed me a short time to put on my wedding dress and veil. "Jane, you look lovely," he said, "but you can only have 10 minutes for breakfast." We almost ran up the road to the church, his strong hand holding mine. His dark face looked stern, and he did not speak. I did not notice the weather or my surroundings at all. I only wanted to know why he looked so fierce. Suddenly, he noticed how pale I was, and stopped for a moment to let me get my breath back. Then we walked more slowly into the church. The priest and the clerk were waiting for us. There was nobody else except 2 strangers who were standing at the back of the church. The ceremony began, and soon I heard the priest come to the point in the wedding where he had to ask, "Is there any reason why these 2 people should not be married?" The priest paused for a second, as was the custom, but before he could continue, A voice from the back of the church said clearly, "There is a reason." The priest looked up from his book and stood silent. Mr. Rochester said in his deep voice, without turning his head, "Continue with the ceremony." Silence fell again. Then the priest shook his head. "I must investigate this first," he said. One of the strangers from the back of the church came forward and said calmly and quietly, "This wedding cannot continue because Mr. Rochester is already married." I felt as if I had been hit. Mr. Rochester's whole face was like colourless marble. Without speaking or smiling, he was holding me tightly round the waist, as if he would never let go. "Who are you?" he growled at the stranger. "And tell me what you know of this supposed wife of mine." "I'm a lawyer, sir. I have a certificate here proving that you married Bertha Mason in the West Indies 15 years ago." "That may prove I've been married, but it doesn't prove that she's still alive." "I can produce a witness," said the lawyer, "who has seen her alive recently." "Produce him or go to hell," said Mr. Rochester. "Here he is. Mr. Mason," called the lawyer. And the second stranger slowly approached from the shadows, his pale face looking frightened. Mr. Rochester, staring furiously at him, raised his strong right arm to knock him down. "No!" cried Mason, trembling. Mr. Rochester dropped his arm and turned away in disgust. "Sir," said the priest, frowning, "don't forget we are in the house of God. Mr. Mason, please tell us if this gentleman's wife is still alive." "She's at Thornfield Hall," replied Mason in a weak voice. "I'm her brother, and I've seen her there." "Thornfield Hall?" cried the priest. "I've lived here for years, and I've never heard of a Mrs. Rochester." "I was careful to keep her a secret," murmured Mr. Rochester, frowning. After a few minutes' thought, he announced, "I must reveal the truth, I suppose. There will be no wedding today. No doubt God will punish me for this. What this lawyer says is true. I've been married, and my wife still lives. I was tricked into marrying her when I was young in the West Indies. Madness runs in her family, but they didn't tell me that. Now she's more of an animal than a woman. I keep her locked away, guarded by my old servant, Grace Poole. I invite you all to come to my house to see her, and to judge whether I had the right to ask this innocent young girl to marry me. Follow me." Still holding me firmly, he left the church, followed by the others. At the door of Thornfield Hall, Mrs. Fairfax, Adele, and the servants rushed forward, smiling, to congratulate us. "Too late," cried the master, waving them away. "Your congratulations are 15 years too late." We all went up to the top floor and entered the room where Mason had been attacked. Mr. Rochester lifted the curtain, opened the secret door, and showed us the little room. Grace Poole was making soup over a fire, and behind her a shape crawled on the floor. It was hard to say whether it was animal or human. It growled like a wild animal, but it wore clothes and had long, thick, dark hair. "How are you, Mrs. Poole?" asked the master. "And how is your patient today?" "Not bad, sir," answered Grace. "But be careful. She'll try and bite you if she sees you, sir." Just then the shape turned, and with a fierce cry attacked Mr. Rochester violently. I recognized her dark, ugly face. They struggled for a moment, and then he held her down and, with Mrs. Poole's help, tied her to a chair. He turned to the others with a bitter smile. "You see, gentlemen, this is my wife. This is the partner I have to live with forever. And instead, I wish to have this," laying his hand on my shoulder. "This young girl. Can you honestly blame me? Compare the two and then judge me." We all left the room silently. As we went downstairs, the lawyer said to me, "I know you weren't aware of this, Miss Eyre. Nobody will blame you. And Mr. Mason will tell your uncle so when he goes back to Madeira." "My uncle? Do you know him?" I asked, surprised. "I'm his lawyer. Mr. Mason and he have often done business together. On his way back to the West Indies, Mr. Mason stopped in Madeira and stayed with Mr. Eyre, who mentioned that his niece was going to marry a Mr. Rochester." "Yes, I wrote to tell him I was getting married," I said. "Well, when Mr. Mason explained that Mr. Rochester was already married, your uncle sent him straight back to England to prevent you from marrying and making a terrible mistake. I'm afraid your uncle is very ill and will probably die soon, so I think you had better stay in England until you receive further news of him." After the gentleman had left, I entered my room and locked the door. Slowly I took off my wedding dress and veil. I was weak and exhausted, and only just beginning to realize what had happened. Could I ever again trust the being I had turned into a sort of god? I would not think of him as evil, but he could not have felt real love for me. How foolish I had been to believe him and love him so much. My hopes were all dead, and my future was empty. I lay on my bed, faint and wishing for death, while darkness swam around me. Chapter 18. Mr. Rochester's Explanation. Sometime in the afternoon I recovered a little, but I felt faint as I stood up and realized I had not eaten anything all day. So I opened my bedroom door and almost fell over Mr. Rochester, who was sitting in a chair just outside. "I've been waiting for you all this time, Jane," he said, "and I haven't heard you scream or shout or cry. Aren't you angry with me? I never meant to hurt you. Will you ever forgive me?" He sounded so sincere that I forgave him at once in my heart. "Scold me, Jane. Tell me how wicked I am," he said. "Sir, I can't. I feel tired and weak. I want some water." He took me in his arms and carried me downstairs to the library, where he put me in front of the fire and gave me a glass of wine. I began to feel better. He bent to kiss me, but I turned my face determinedly away. "What?" he cried. "You refuse to kiss me? Because I'm Bertha Mason's husband? Is that it?" "Yes, sir." "I know you very well, Jane. I know how firm you are when you've decided something. You're planning to destroy my hope of happiness. You intend to be a stranger to me from now on. And if I'm friendly towards you in future, you'll remind yourself, that man nearly made me his mistress. I must be ice cold to him. And ice cold is what you'll be." "It's true, sir," I said, trying to stop my voice from trembling, "that everything around me has changed. So I must change too. Adele must have a new governess." "Oh, Adele will go to boarding school. I've already decided that. And you and I will both leave this house, this narrow stone hell, this house of living death. We can never be happy here, under the same roof as that woman. Oh, I hate her." "You shouldn't hate her, sir," I said. "It's not her fault she's mad, poor thing." "Jane, my darling, it's not because she's mad that I hate her. If you were mad, I wouldn't hate you. I'd look after you lovingly. But why talk of madness? We are all ready to travel. Everything is packed. Tomorrow we'll leave. I have a place to go to where nobody will find us or talk about us." "And take Adele with you, sir. She'll be a companion for you," I interrupted. I knew I had to tell him soon. "Adele? What do you mean, Jane? She's going to school. I don't want her, I want you with me. Do you understand?" I did, but I slowly shook my head. He was becoming angry and was staring fiercely at me. He looked as if he was about to lose control. I was not at all afraid, because I knew I still had the power to calm him. So I took his hand and stroked it, saying, "Sit down, sir. I'll talk or listen to you as long as you like." I had been struggling with tears for some time, and now I let them flow freely. It was a great relief. "Don't cry, Jane. Please be calm," he begged. "How can I be calm when you're so angry?" "I'm not angry, but I love you so much, and your pale little face looks so stern and decided." He tried to put his arm around me, but I would not let him. "Jane," he said sadly, "you don't love me then." "I do love you," I answered, "more than ever. But this is the last time I can say it. There is only one thing for me to do, but you'll be furious if I mention it." "Oh, mention it. If I'm angry, you can always burst into tears," he said with a half-smile. "Mr. Rochester, I must leave you. I must start a new life among strangers." "Of course. I told you we would leave. I'll ignore that nonsense about you leaving me. You'll be Mrs. Rochester, and I'll be your husband until I die. We live happily and innocently together in a little white house I have in the south of France. Jane, don't shake your head or I'll get angry." "Sir, your wife is alive," I dared to say, although he was looking aggressively at me. "And if I lived with you like that, I'd be your mistress." "I'm a fool," he said suddenly. "I haven't told you the whole story. Oh, I'm sure you'll agree when you know everything. Listen, Jane, you know that my father loved money very much." "I heard someone say that, yes, sir." "Well, he hated the idea of dividing the family property, so he left it all to my elder brother. But that meant I would be poor unless I married a rich wife. So he decided I should marry Bertha Mason, the daughter of his wealthy friend, Jonas Mason. I was young and easily impressed, so when I saw her in the West Indies, beautiful and elegantly dressed, I thought I loved her. What a fool I was then. After the wedding, I learned that my bride's mother and younger brother were both mad. Dick Mason will probably be in the same state one day. My father knew all this, but did not tell me. I soon found that Bertha and I had nothing in common. Not only was she coarse and stupid, her madness also made her violent. I lived with her for 4 years. By now my father and brother were dead, so I was rich, but I considered myself poor because I was tied to a mad wife until death. I pity you, sir. I do pity you." "Pity, Jane, is an insult from some people, but from you I accept it as the mother of love. Well, I had moments of despair when I intended to shoot myself, but in the end I decided to bring the madwoman back to Thornfield Hall, where nobody knew that we were married. She has lived here ever since. Even Mrs. Fairfax and the servants don't know the whole truth about her. But although I pay Grace Poole well and trust her absolutely, she sometimes drinks too much and allows the creature to escape. Twice she's got out of her room at night, as you know. The first time she nearly burnt me in my bed, and the second time she visited you, and must have been reminded of her own wedding day by seeing your wedding dress." "And what did you do, sir, when you had brought her here?" "I travelled all over Europe, Jane. I was looking for a good and intelligent woman to love." "But you couldn't marry, sir," I interrupted. "I believed I could. I thought I might find some reasonable woman who would understand my case and accept me." "Well, sir, did you?" "Not in Europe, Jane, where I spent 10 long years looking for an ideal. I tried taking mistresses like Celine, the French dancer, but finally, bitter and disappointed with my wasted life, I returned to Thornfield on a frosty winter afternoon. And when my horse slipped and fell on the ice, a little figure appeared and insisted on helping me. In the weeks that followed, I began to depend on that bird-like little figure for my happiness and new interest in life. "Don't talk any more of the past, sir," I said, wiping a secret tear from my eye. "No, Jane, you're right. The future is much brighter. You understand now, don't you? I've wasted half my life in misery and loneliness, but now I've found you. You are at the centre of my heart. It was stupid of me to try to marry you like that without explaining. I should have confessed everything as I do now, and appealed to your great generosity of spirit. I promised to love you and stay with you forever. Jane promised me the same." A pause. "Why are you silent, Jane?" This was a terrible moment for me. In the struggle and confusion that was going on in my heart, I knew that he loved me and I loved him, but I also knew that I must leave him. "Jane, just promise me I will be yours." "Mr. Rochester, I will not be yours." Another pause. "Jane," he said with a gentleness that cut into my soul. "Jane, do you intend us to live apart forever?" "I do." "Jane," bending towards me and kissing me, "is that still your intention?" "It is," I replied, pulling away from him. "Oh, Jane, this is a bitter shock. It would not be wicked to love me." "It would be wicked to do what you want." "Jane, just imagine my horrible life when you have gone. I shall be alone with that madwoman upstairs. Where shall I find friendship and hope?" "You can only trust in God and yourself. Live without doing wrong and die hoping to go to heaven." "That's impossible without you. And you have no family to offend by living with me." He was beginning to sound desperate. I knew that what he said was true. However, in my heart, I also knew I was right to leave. He seemed to read my thoughts. Rushing furiously across the room, he seized me violently and stared fiercely into my eyes. He could have broken me in two with one hand, but he could not break my spirit. Small and weak as I was, I stared firmly back at him. "Your eyes, Jane," he said, "are the eyes of a bird, a free, wild being. Even if I break your cage, I can't reach you. Beautiful creature. You'll fly away from me. But you could choose to fly to me. Come, Jane, come." He let me go and only looked at me. How hard it was to resist that look. "I'm going," I said. "Does my deep love mean nothing to you? Oh, Jane, my hope, my love, my life!" And he threw himself despairingly on the sofa. I had reached the door, but I could not leave. I walked back, bent over him, and kissed his cheek. "Goodbye, my dear master," I said. "May God protect you." "Without your love, Jane, my heart is broken," he said. "But perhaps you will, so generously, give me your love after all." He jumped up, with hope in his eyes, holding out his arms to me, but I turned and ran out of the room. That night, I only slept a little, dreaming of the Red Room at Gateshead. The moonlight shone into my bedroom as it did then, and I saw a vision on the ceiling, a white figure looking down on me. It seemed to whisper to my spirit, "Daughter, leave now before you are tempted to stay." "Mother, I will," I answered. And when I woke up, although it was still dark outside, I wrapped up some spare clothes in a parcel and put a little money in a purse. As I crept downstairs, I could hear Mr. Rochester in his room, walking up and down and sighing. I could find heaven in this room if I wanted. I just had to enter and say, "I will love you and live with you through life until death." My hand moved towards the handle, but I stopped myself. and went miserably downstairs and out of the house. Setting out on the road, I could not help thinking of Mr. Rochester's despair when he found himself abandoned. I hated myself for wounding him, and for perhaps driving him to a life of wickedness or even death. I wanted desperately to be with him, to comfort him, but somehow I made myself keep walking, and when a coach passed, I arranged to travel on it as far as my money would pay for. Inside the coach, I cried the bitterest tears of my life.